introduce an underlined technical term, you must define it immediately before or after. Do not underline for emphasis. In general, avoid emphasis of any kind, including exclamation points. Also avoid ellipsis points used for anything other than to indicate a specific omission from a text you have quoted. Exclamation points, ellipses used to suspend a thought or sentence, and underlined non-technical terms are typical of amateur writers and appear only in self-published books. 6.1.3 Sections. A section can have a number of subsections, as in this chapter. If you underline the title of a section, not underlining the title of a subsection will suffice to distinguish the two, even if their distance from the text is the same. On the other hand, as you can see, strategic numbering can also help. Distinguish a section from a subsection. Readers will understand that the first Arabic numeral indicates the chapter, the second Arabic numeral indicates the section, and the third indicates the subsection. 6.1.3 Sections. Here I have repeated the title of this subsection to illustrate another system for formatting it. In this system, the title is underlined and run into the first paragraph of text. This system is perfectly fine, except it prevents you from using the same method for a further subdivision of the subsection, something that may at times be useful. You could also use a numbering system without titles. For example, here is an alternative way to introduce the subsection you are reading. 6.1.3 Notice that the text begins immediately after the numbers. Ideally, 2 blank lines would separate the new subsection from the previous one. Notwithstanding, the use of titles not only helps the reader but also requires coherence on the author's part, because it obliges him to define the section in question. With or without titles, the numbers that identify the chapters and the paragraphs can vary. See section 6.4 for more suggestions on numbering. Remember that the structure of the table of contents must mirror the exact structure of the text. 6.1.4 Quotation marks and other signs. Use quotation marks in the following cases. 1. To quote another author's sentence or sentences in the body of the text, as I will do here by mentioning that, according to Campbell and Ballou, direct quotations not over 3 typewritten lines in length are enclosed in quotation marks and are run into the text. 1. William Giles Campbell and Stephen Vaughan Ballou, Form and Style, 4th edition, 40. 2. To quote another author's individual terms, as I will do by mentioning that, according to the already cited Campbell and Ballou, there are 2 types of footnotes, content and reference. After the first use of the terms, if we accept our author's terminology and adopt these technical terms in our thesis, we will no longer use quotation marks when we repeat these terms. 3. To add the connotation of so-called to terms of common usage, or terms that are used by other authors. For example, we can write that what idealist aesthetics called poetry did not have the same breadth that the term has when it appears in a publisher's catalog as a technical term opposed to fiction and non-fiction. Similarly, we will say that Jelmslev's notion of sign function challenges the current notion of sign. We do not recommend, as some do, using quotation marks to emphasize a word, as an underline better fulfills this function. 4. To quote lines in a dramatic work. When quoting a dramatic work, it is not incorrect to write that Hamlet pronounces the line, to be or not to be, that is the question, but instead we recommend the following. Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. Use the second format unless the critical literature that you are consulting uses other systems by tradition. And how should you indicate a quote within another quote? Use single quotation marks for the quote within a quote, as in the following example, in which according to Smith, the famous line to be or not to be, that is the question, has been the warhorse of all Shakespearean actors. And what if Smith said that Brown said that Wolfram said something? Some writers solve this problem by writing that, according to Smith's well-known statement, all who agree with Brown in refusing Wolfram's principle that being and not being coincide incur an unjustifiable error. But if you refer to Rule 8 of Section 5.3.1, you will see that, by setting off Smith's quote from the main text, you will avoid the need for a third level of quotation marks. Some European writers use a third kind of quotation marks known as guillemets, or French quotation marks. It is rare to find them in an Italian thesis because the typewriter cannot produce them. Yet recently I found myself in need of them in one of my own texts. I was already using double quotation marks for short quotes and for the so-called connotation, and I had to distinguish the use of a term as a signifier and as a signified. Therefore, I was able to write that the word dog means carnivorous and quadruped animal, etc., and similar statements. These are rare cases, and you will have to make a decision based on the critical literature that you are using, working by hand with a pen in the typewritten thesis, just as I have done in this page. Specific topics require other signs. It is not possible to give general instructions for these, although we can provide some examples here. For some projects in logic, mathematics, or non-European languages, you can only write these signs by hand. This is certainly difficult work. However, you may find that your typewriter can produce alternative graphemes. Naturally, you will have to ask your advisor if you can make these substitutions, or consult the critical literature on your topic. As an example, Table 6.1 gives a series of logic expressions that can be transcribed into the less laborious versions on the right. The first 5 substitutions are also acceptable in print, the last 3 are acceptable in the context of a typewritten thesis, although you should perhaps insert a note that justifies your decision and makes it explicit. You may encounter similar issues if you are working in linguistics, where a phoneme can be represented as but also as b. In other kinds of formalization, parenthetical systems can be reduced to sequences of parentheses. So, for example, the expression can become. Similarly, the author of a thesis in transformational linguistics knows that he can use parentheses to represent syntactic tree branching. In any case, anyone embarking on these kinds of specialized projects probably already knows these special conventions. 6.1.5 Transliterations and diacritics. To transliterate is to transcribe a text using the closest corresponding letters from an alphabet that is different from the original. Transliteration does not attempt to give a phonetic interpretation of a text, but reproduces the original letter by letter so that anyone can reconstruct the text in its original spelling if they know both alphabets. Transliteration is used for the majority of historic geographical names, as well as for words that do not have an English language equivalent. Table 6.2 shows the rules of transliteration of the Greek alphabet and the Cyrillic alphabet. Diacritics are signs that modify normal letters of the alphabet to give them a particular phonetic value. Italian accents are diacritics. For example, the acute accent on the final E of the Italian perch gives it its closed pronunciation. Other diacritics include the French cedilla of C, the Spanish tilde of N, the German diaresis of U, and also the less-known signs of other alphabets, such as the Czech C or C with hasek, the Danish O or O with stroke, and the Polish L or L with stroke. In a thesis you can eliminate, for example, the stroke on the L and the acute accents on the O and Z. Instead of writing lauds you can write lauds. Newspapers also do this. However, for the Latin languages there are stricter rules. Let us look at some specific examples. Respect the use of all diacritics that appear in the French alphabet, such as the cedilla in CAIRA. Respect the particular signs of the Spanish alphabet, the vowels with the acute accent and the N with tilde N. Respect the particular signs of the Portuguese alphabet such as the vowels with the tilde and the C. Also, always respect the 3 particular signs of the German alphabet, A, O, and U. And always write U, and not UE. For all other languages, you must decide case by case, and as usual the solution will differ depending on whether you quote an isolated word or are writing your thesis on a text that is written in that particular language. 6.1.6 Punctuation, Foreign Accents, and Abbreviations. There are differences in the use of punctuation and the conventions for quotation marks, notes, and accents even among the major presses. A thesis can be less precise than a typescript ready for publication. Nevertheless, it is useful to understand and apply the general criteria for punctuation. As a model, I will reproduce the instructions provided by Bompiani Editor, the press that published the original Italian version of this book, but we caution that other publishers may use different criteria. What matters here are not the criteria themselves, but the coherence of their application. Periods and commas. When periods and commas follow quotes enclosed in quotation marks, they must be inserted inside the quotation marks, provided that the quoted text is a complete sentence. For example, we will say that, in commenting on Wolfram's theory, Smith asks whether we should accept Wolfram's opinion that being is identical to not being from any possible point of view. As you can see, the final period is inside the quotation marks because Wolfram's quote also ended with a period. On the other hand, we will say that Smith does not agree with Wolfram's statement that being is identical to not being. Here we put the period after the quotation mark. Because only a portion of Wolfram's sentence is quoted. We will do the same thing for commas. We will say that Smith, after quoting Wolfram's opinion that being is identical to not being, very convincingly refutes it. And we will proceed differently when we quote, for example, the following sentence, "I truly do not believe," he said, "that this is possible." We can also see that a comma is omitted before an open parenthesis. Therefore, we will not write, "He loved variegated words, fragrant sounds, and velvety pulses," but instead he loved variegated words, fragrant sounds, and velvety pulses. Superscript note reference numbers. Insert the superscript note reference number after the punctuation mark. You will therefore write, for example, the best literature review on the topic, second only to Vulpius, is the one written by Krahenbuhl. The latter does not satisfy Pepper's standards of clarity, but is defined by Grumps as a model of completeness. 1. This is a dummy note, inserted to illustrate the correct format. The author is fictional. 2. Fictional author. 3. Fictional author. 4. Fictional author. Foreign accents. In Italian, if the vowels a, I, o, and u are accented at the end of a word, the accent is grave. Instead, the vowel e at the end of a word almost always requires the acute accent with a few exceptions, a, sio, cafe, t, aheim, pie, die, sty, simpans. All Italian words of French origin also contain grave accents, such as guile, canopy, latch, bibi, bigny, proper nouns such as Josue, Mose, no, and others. Also in Italian, tonic accents are omitted, with the exception of subito and principi in ambiguous sentences. Tra principi e principi inserti falarono I modi del 1821. Also remember that Spanish words have only acute accents, Hernandez, Garcia Lorca, Varon. Abbreviations. Table 6.3 provides a list of common abbreviations. Specific subjects. Have separate series of abbreviations that you will learn by reading the critical literature on your thesis topic. Table 6.3. Common abbreviations. Anon. Anonymous. Art. Article. BK. 6.1.7 Some miscellaneous advice. Do not capitalize general concepts, and pay attention when you capitalize proper nouns. You can certainly write love and hate if you are examining two precise philosophical notions of an ancient author, but a contemporary author who talks about the cult of the family uses the capitals only with irony. In a thesis in the field of cultural anthropology, if you wish to dissociate yourself from a concept that you attribute to others, it is preferable to write, the cult of the family. For historical periods, refer to the Revolutionary period and the Tertiary era. Here are some more examples that are generally accepted: Write North America, Black Sea, Mount Fuji, World Bank, Federal Reserve, Sistine Chapel, House of Representatives, Massachusetts General Hospital, Bank of Labor, European Economic Community, and sometimes Central Station. Only capitalize the word station if it is part of the proper noun. Write Grand Central Station for Chicago's famous Central Railway Station that was recently demolished, but if you are commuting to Boston University from out of state, your train arrives at Back Bay Station. Also, write Magna Carta, Bulla Aurea, and St. Mark's Basilica. Refer to the letters of St. Catherine, the monastery of St. Benedict and the rule of St. Benedict, and in French, use Monsieur Tast and Madame Verdurin. Italians write Piazza Garibaldi and Via Roma, but Americans write Washington Square Park and Wall Street. Capitalize German common names, as Germans do, Ostpolitik. Kulturgeschichte. You must capitalize proper nouns such as Italians, Congolese, the Pulitzer Prize, and the Holy Father, but you may write the bishop, the doctor, the colonel, the president, the North, and the South. Generally speaking, you should put everything you can into lowercase letters, as long as you can do so without compromising the intelligibility of the text. For more precise usages, follow the critical literature in the specific discipline you are studying, but be sure to model your text after those published in the last decade. When you open quotation marks of any kind, always close them. This seems like an obvious recommendation, but it is one of the most common oversights in typewritten texts. A quote begins, and nobody knows where it ends. Use Arabic numerals in moderation. Obviously, this advice does not apply if you are writing a thesis in mathematics or statistics, or if you are quoting precise data and percentages. However, in the middle of a more general argument, write that an army had 50,000 soldiers, but that a work is comprised of 3 volumes, unless you are writing a reference, in which you should use 3 volumes. Write that the losses have increased by 10%, that a person has lived until the ripe old age of 101, that a cultural revolution occurred in the 60s, and that the city was 7 miles away. Whenever possible, write complete dates such as May 17, 1973, and not 5/17/73. Naturally, you can use abbreviated dates when you must date an entire series of documents, pages of a diary, etc. Write that a particular event happened at 11:30, but write that during the course of an experiment, the water had risen approximately 9.8 inches at 11:30 a.m. Write the matriculation number 7535, the home at 30 Daisy Avenue, and page 144 of a certain book. Underline only when necessary. As we have said, underline foreign terms that have not been absorbed by English, such as borgata or Einfühlung. But do not underline ciao, pasta, ballerina, opera, and maestro. Do not underline brand names or famous monuments, the Vespa sped near the Colosseum. Usually, foreign philosophical terms are not pluralized or declined even if they are underlined, Husserl's or Leibniz or the universe of the various Gestalt. However, this becomes problematic if in the same text you use Latin terms and decline them. We will therefore analyze all the subjecta and not only the subjectum that is the object of the perceptual experience. It is better to avoid these difficult situations by using the corresponding English term. Usually one adopts the foreign term simply to show off his erudition, or by rephrasing the sentence. Wisely alternate ordinal and cardinal numbers, Roman and Arabic numerals. Although the practice is becoming less common, Roman numerals can indicate the major subdivision of a work. A reference like 13. 3" could indicate either Volume 13, Book 3, or Canto 13, Line 3. You can also write 13.3 and the reader will understand you, but 3.13 will look strange. You can write Hamlet 3, 2, 28 and it will be clear that you are referring to line 28 of the second scene of the third act of Hamlet, or you can write Hamlet 3, 2, 28. But do not write Hamlet 3, 2, 18ei. Indicate images, tables, or maps as Figure 1.1 and Table 4.1. Reread the typescript. Do this not only to correct the typographical errors, but also to check that the note numbers correspond to the superscript numbers in the text and that the page numbers in the works you have cited are correct. Be absolutely sure to check the following. Pages, are they numbered consecutively? Cross-references, do they correspond to the right chapter or page? Quotes, are they enclosed in quotation marks, and have you closed all quotations? Have you been consistent in using ellipses, square brackets, and indentations? Is each quote properly cited? Notes, does the superscript note reference number in the text correspond to the actual note number? If you are using footnotes, is the note appropriately separated from the body of the text? Are the notes numbered consecutively, or are there missing numbers? Bibliography. Are authors in alphabetical order? Did you mix up any first and last names? Are all the bibliographical references complete? Did you include accessory details? For some entries, but not for others? Did you clearly distinguish books from journal articles and book chapters? Does each entry end with a period? 6.2 The Final Bibliography. Had we not already discussed this topic at length at least twice, this would be a very long and detailed section. In section 3.2.3 we discussed how to record bibliographical information for books and articles, and in sections 5.4.2 and 5. For point 3 we discussed both how to reference a work in the text and in a note, and how to format references so they work with the final bibliography. If you return to these 3 sections, you will find everything you need to write a good final bibliography. Additionally, let us say first of all that a thesis must have a final bibliography, notwithstanding the detail and precision of the references in the notes. You cannot force your reader to shuffle through pages of text to find needed information. For some theses, the final bibliography is a useful if not essential addition. For others, the final bibliography may constitute the most interesting part: studies on the critical literature of a given topic, a thesis on all the published and unpublished works of a given author, or a thesis centered on bibliographical research, such as studies on fascism from 1945 to 1950. Where obviously the final bibliography is not an aid but the primary goal. Finally, we just need to add a few instructions on how to structure a bibliography. Let us imagine, for example, a thesis on Bertrand Russell. We will divide the bibliography into works by Bertrand Russell and works on Bertrand Russell. Russell's works will appear in chronological order while the critical literature on Russell will appear in alphabetical order, unless the topic of the thesis is studies on Bertrand Russell from 1950 to 1960 in England, in which case the critical literature should also appear in chronological order. In a thesis about Watergate, we could divide the bibliography as follows: excerpts from the Nixon White House tapes, court transcripts and other court documents, official statements, media coverage, and critical literature. As you can see, the format will change according to the thesis type, and the goal is to organize your bibliography so that it allows readers to identify and distinguish between primary and secondary sources, rigorous critical studies and less reliable secondary sources, etc. In essence, and based on what we have said in the previous chapters, the aims of a bibliography are to clearly identify a source, to enable the reader to find the source if needed, to demonstrate the author's familiarity with the chosen discipline. Demonstrating familiarity with the discipline entails demonstrating both knowledge of all the literature on your topic and a command of the discipline's bibliographical conventions. Regarding the latter, it may be that the standard conventions described in this book are not the best for your situation, and for this reason you should model your work on the critical literature in your specific field. Regarding the former, you will need to decide whether to include only the works you have consulted or all those that exist on a particular topic. The most obvious answer is that the bibliography of a thesis must list only the works you have consulted, and that any other solution would be dishonest. But here too, it depends on the type of thesis you are writing. For example, the specific aim of your research project may include compiling all the written texts on a specific topic, even though it may be humanly impossible to read them all before you graduate. In this case, you should clearly state that you did not consult all the works in the bibliography, and should indicate those you did read, perhaps with an asterisk. But such a project is valid only where there are no existing complete bibliographies, so that your work consists precisely of compiling references that were once scattered. If by chance there is already a complete bibliography, it is better to refer the reader to it, and to include in your bibliography only the works you have actually consulted. Often the reliability of a bibliography is evident from its title. Readers will have very different expectations from titles such as bibliographical references, works cited, and general bibliography on topic X. You cannot use the title Bibliography on the Second World War for a meager bibliography of 30 titles in English. Instead, simply call it works cited and hope for the best. And no matter how meager your bibliography is, at least make an effort to put it in the correct alphabetical order. There are some rules. Begin with the last name, and obviously titles of nobility like de and von do not belong to the last name, while capitalized prepositions do. So include D'Annunzio under D, but Ferdinand de Saussure under S, as Saussure, Ferdinand de. Write de Amicis, Edmondo, du Bellay, Joachim, La Fontaine, Jean de, but write Beethoven, Ludwig van. Here too, keep an eye on the critical literature and follow its conventions. For example, for ancient authors, alphabetize by the first name. Do not alphabetize by what might seem to be the last name but is actually a patronymic or an indication of place of birth. In conclusion, below is a standard division for the final bibliography of a generic thesis. Primary sources: bibliographical indexes. Secondary sources on the topic or the author. Additional material. 6.3. The Appendices. In some cases, the appendix or appendices are indispensable. If you are writing a thesis in philology and discussing a rare text that you have found and transcribed, you can present this text in the appendix, and this may be the most original contribution of the entire work. In a thesis in history in which you often refer to a certain document, you could present it in the appendix, even if it has already been published. A thesis in law that discusses a law or a body of laws should present these in the appendix. Place tables, diagrams, and statistical data in the appendix, unless they are short examples that you can insert into the main text. In general, place particular materials in the appendix to prevent long and boring quotes in the body of the text and to facilitate quick reference. Place in the appendix all the data and documents that would burden the text and make reading difficult. On the other hand, numerous references to the appendix can also make reading difficult, especially if they force the reader to constantly page back and forth between the section he is reading and the end of the thesis. In these cases, you should follow common sense, if nothing else, by doing everything you can to make the text clear, inserting short citations, and summarizing the content of the material which appears in the appendix. If you think it is fitting to develop a certain theoretical point, yet you realize that it interferes with the development of your overall argument because it is an accessory to or an extension of your topic, you can place the treatment of that point in the appendix. Suppose you are writing a thesis on the influence of Aristotle's Poetics and Rhetoric on Renaissance thought, and you discover that, in the 20th century, the Chicago School has offered contemporary reinterpretations of these texts. If the observations of the Chicago School are useful to clarify the relationship between Aristotle and Renaissance thought, you will cite them in the text. But it may be interesting to go deeper into the topic in a separate appendix, where you can use the example of the Chicago schools. Reinterpretations to illustrate how not only Renaissance scholars but also scholars in our century have made an effort to revitalize the Aristotelian texts. Similarly, you may find yourself writing a thesis in Romance philology on the character of Tristan and dedicating an appendix to the myths used by the decadent movement, from Wagner to Thomas Mann. This topic is not immediately relevant to the philological topic of your thesis, but you may wish to argue that Wagner's interpretation provides interesting suggestions to the philologist or, on the contrary, that it represents a model of flawed philology, perhaps suggesting further reflection and investigation. This kind of appendix is not recommended for a thesis because it better suits the work of a mature scholar who can take the liberty of venturing into erudite digressions and various modes of criticism. However, I am suggesting it for psychological reasons. Inspired by your enthusiasm, you will sometimes discover complementary or alternative avenues of research, and you will not resist the temptation to discuss these insights. By reserving these insights for the appendix, you will be able to satisfy your need to express them without compromising the rigor of your thesis. 6.4. The table of contents. In the table of contents, you must record all the chapters, sections, and subsections of the text, and you must exactly match their numbering, pages, and wording. This may seem like obvious advice, but before handing in the thesis, you should carefully verify that you have met these requirements. The table of contents is an indispensable service that you provide both to the reader and to yourself, as it helps one to quickly locate a particular topic. Generally in English and also in many German books, it appears at the beginning. In Italian and French books, it appears at the end. I think the table of contents is more convenient at the beginning of a work. You can find it after a few pages, whereas you have to exert more energy to consult it at the end. But if it is at the beginning, it should truly be at the beginning. Some English books place it after the preface, but often after the preface comes an introduction to the first edition, then an introduction to the second edition. This is an outrage. They may as well place the table of contents in the middle of the book. An alternative is to place a table of contents proper at the very beginning of a work, and a more detailed version with exhaustive subdivisions at the end. Another alternative is to place the table of contents with the chapters at the beginning, and an index of subjects at the end, generally accompanied by an index of names. However, this is not necessary in a thesis. It is sufficient to write a detailed table of contents, and preferably to place it at the beginning of the thesis, right after the title page. The structure of the table of contents must mirror that of the text, as must the format. This means that if in the text section 1.2 is a section of chapter 1, you must make this evident in the layout of the table of contents. To clarify, we will provide two models of a table of contents in Table 6.4, but you could organize the chapters and sections differently using Roman and Arabic numerals, letters, etc. Table 6.4. Models of a table of contents, Example 1. The World of Charlie Brown. Introduction 3. 1. Charlie Brown and American Comics 1.1. From Yellow Kid to Charlie Brown 7 1.2. Adventurous and Humorous Threads 9 1.3. The Schultz Case 10 2. Daily Strips and Sunday Pages. 2.1. Differences in Narrative Rhythm 18 2.2. Thematic Differences 21 3. Ideological Content 3.1 The Vision of Childhood 33. 3.2 The Implicit Vision of the Family 38. 3.3 Personal Identity 45. 3.3.1 Who am I? 58. 3.3.2 Who are the others? 65. 3.3.3 Being popular 78. 3.4 Neurosis and mental health 88. 4 The evolution of the graphic sign 96. Conclusion 160 Statistical tables, reading ratings in the U.S. 189 Appendix 1, Peanuts Cartoons 200 Appendix 2, Imitations of Peanuts 234 Bibliography, the collected volumes 250. Schultz's articles, interviews, and statements 260 Studies on Schultz in the U.S. 276. In other countries 277. Models of a table of contents, example 2. The World of Charlie Brown. Introduction 3. Charlie Brown and American Comics 7-2. Daily Strips and Sunday Pages 18-3. Ideological Content 33. 4. The Evolution of the Graphic Sign 96. Conclusion 160. You could number the table of contents shown in Table 6.4 as follows. A. First Chapter A.1. First Section A.2. Second Section A.2.1. First Subsection A.2.2. Second Subsection, etc. Or you could present it this way. First Chapter E.1. First Section I.2. Second Section I.2.1. First Subsection I.2.2. Second Subsection, etc. You can even choose other criteria, as long as they provide the same immediate clarity and evidence. As you can see, it is not necessary to conclude the titles with a period. Also, it is a good rule to align the numbers to the right of the column and not the left, as follows. 7, 8, 9, 10. Not 7, 8, 9, 10. The same applies to Roman numerals. Sophistication? No, cleanliness. If your tie is crooked, you straighten it, and even a hippie does not like to have pigeon droppings on his shoulder. 7 Conclusions. I would like to conclude with 2 observations. First, writing a thesis should be fun. Second, writing a thesis is like cooking a pig, nothing goes to waste. If you lack research experience and are afraid to begin your thesis, you may be terrorized after reading this book. Confronted with all these rules and instructions, you may feel that it is impossible to get out alive. But remember this, for the sake of completeness, I wrote this book for a hypothetical student without any experience. But you have probably already read some pertinent books, and you have probably already acquired many of the techniques described in this book. My book can then serve as a reminder, bringing to awareness what many of you have already absorbed without realizing it. A driver, when he is confronted with a record of his own actions, realizes that he is a prodigious machine that makes vital decisions within a fraction of a second, with no margin for error. And still, almost everyone drives a car, and the vast majority of drivers and passengers get out alive. What really matters is that you write your thesis with gusto. If you choose a topic that interests you, and if you truly dedicate to your thesis the time you have allotted, however short, you will experience the thesis as a game, as a bet, or as a treasure hunt. There is the satisfaction of competitive sports in hunting a text that is difficult to find, and there is the satisfaction of solving an enigma and discovering, after long reflection, the solution to an apparently insoluble problem. You must experience the thesis as a challenge. You are the challenger. At the beginning you posed a question which you did not yet know how to answer. The challenge is to find the solution in a finite number of moves. Sometimes, you can experience the thesis as a game between you and your author. He seems to conceal his secret from you, and you must trick him, question him gently, compel him to say what he does not want to say, but what he should have said. Sometimes, the thesis is a game of solitaire. You have all the pieces, and the challenge is to make them fall into place. If you play the game with competitive gusto, you will write a good thesis. But if you begin with the idea that it is a meaningless ritual in which you have no interest, you have lost before you have begun. If this is the case, as I have already told you, have someone else write it for you. Or copy it. Do not waste your time, or that of your advisor, the person who must aid you and read your thesis from beginning to end. If you write the thesis with gusto, you will be inspired to continue. Usually, while a student begins working on his thesis, he thinks only about finishing it, and he dreams of the vacation that will follow. But if you work rigorously, it is not abnormal for you to become obsessed with your work, unable to stop. You want to explore in depth all the points that you have omitted, you want to chase all the tangential ideas that struck you but that you eliminated for brevity, you want to read other books, and you want to write essays. This is the sign that the thesis has activated your intellectual metabolism and that it has been a positive experience. It is the sign that you are the victim of a compulsion to research, somewhat like Charlie Chaplin's character in Modern Times, a factory worker who keeps tightening screws even after a long day of work. Like Chaplin, you will have to make an effort to restrain yourself. But once you have temporarily contained this urge, you may realize that you have a calling for research, that the thesis was not simply the means to a degree, and the degree was not simply the means to career advancement or to please your parents. However, your motivation to continue research does not necessarily have to translate into a university career. It also does not preclude you from accepting a job offer upon graduation. You can dedicate a reasonable amount of time to research while working another job, without expecting a university appointment. In many fields, a good professional must also continue to study. If you devote yourself to your research, you will find that a thesis done well is a product of which nothing goes to waste. You can convert your finished thesis into one or more scholarly articles, or maybe even a book. But in time, you may return to your thesis to find material to quote for other projects, or to reuse your readings index cards, maybe using parts that did not make it to the final draft of your first work. The marginal parts of your thesis may present themselves anew, as the beginning of new research projects. You may even decide to return to your thesis after decades. Your thesis is like your first love, it will be difficult to forget. In the end, it will represent your first serious and rigorous academic work, and this is no small thing. Notes. Translators forward. 1. Umberto Eco, Dire quasi la stessa cosa, Esperienze di traduzione, 364. Our translation. 2. All currency conversions are based on the actual June 15, 1977, exchange rate of Italian lire to US dollars. Convertitore storico del valuta, Banca d'Italia. Lingua equals a tanto equals convertitore. Introduction to the original 1977 edition. 1. One could ask why I do not use the female pronoun she when referring to a student, candidate, professor, or advisor. It is because I drew on personal memories and experiences, and I identify better with the male counterpart. Chapter 1. 1. At the time of this book's publication, Italians who held laureate degrees enjoyed preferential access to public sector jobs and automatic career advancement, even if their degree was in a field unrelated to their employment. 2. We could add a fifth rule: the professor should be the appropriate fit for the topic. In fact, there are candidates who wish to work with the professor of subject A, because they feel an affinity with him or because they are simply lazy, despite the fact that their thesis would be better served by the professor of subject B. Often the professor accepts and then is unable to effectively direct the thesis. Chapter 2. 1. C. W. Cooper and E. J. Robbins, The Term Paper, A Manual and Model, 4th edition, 3. 2. In 1968, Italian university students rebelled against what they perceived as an antiquated curriculum, an elitist system that favored privileged applicants, and an unjust distribution of power between students and faculty. 3. Although isolated free radio stations emerged in Italy in the late 1960s, they became a nationwide phenomenon between 1975 and 1979. These private, local radio stations were illegal until 1976 because they broke the frequency monopoly of RAI, Italy's national broadcasting company. The Constitutional Court sentenced No. 202 restricted the monopoly of RAI to national programming and opened local programming to the private sector. However, the Italian parliament failed to provide specific legislation to regulate the activity of the local stations, which is why ECO designates them as semi-legal in 1977. See Stefano Dark, Libera. L'epopea del Radio Italiane degli anni 70, 87, 88. For ARCI, or Associazione Ricreativa Culturale Italiana, was officially constituted in Florence on May 26, 1957, by a national convention of cultural, recreational, and athletic clubs fostering democratic and anti-fascist ideals. L'Associazione. Storia, Arci Bologna. 5. Lotta Continua was a far-left extra-parliamentary movement active in Italy from 1969 to 1976. Chapter 3. 1. Maritain interpretation of the expression visa placent is extremely popular with neo-Thomists, many of whom take his definition of beauty as id quod visum placet, namely, the definition beauty is that which pleases when it is seen, to be a correct quotation from Aquinas. In fact, what Aquinas actually wrote was pulchra enim dicunterque visa placent, that is, things are called beautiful which please when they are seen. Aquinas's words refer to what we might call a sociological fact, whereas Maritain's version amounts to a metaphysical definition. Umberto Eco, The Aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas, trans. Hugh Breton, 240 N22. 2. So that Eco's documentation guidelines will be useful to English-speaking students, we have adapted his preferred reference formats to those recommended by the Chicago Manual of Style, 15th ed. We have similarly adapted Eco's references throughout this book. 3. William Giles Campbell and Stephen Von Ballou, Form and Style, 4th edition, 69. 4. Although searching under the terms 17th century, Baroque, and aesthetics seems fairly obvious, poetics is a slightly more subtle choice. My justification is that a student cannot have formulated this subject from scratch, but in fact a professor, a friend, or a preliminary reading must have prompted him. So he may well have heard the term Baroque poetics or have encountered mentions of poetics in general. So let us assume that the student has this preliminary knowledge. 5. Our translation. Chapter 4. 1. Unlike Italian universities, universities in other countries generally do not require oral exams. Instead, they require papers, that is, an essay or a mini-thesis of 10 to 20 pages for each course. This is a useful system that some Italian professors have also adopted. 2. The partisan war in Monferrato was part of the larger partisan liberation movement known as the Resistenza that took place during the latter years of World War II in opposition to both the Nazi forces occupying Italy and the fascist forces of the Italian Social Republic. While allied against the same enemies, partisans in the Garibaldian brigades were generally associated with the Italian Communist Party, while those in the Badogliane formations were politically moderate and loyal to King Vittorio Emanuele III and Marshal Pietro Badoglio. The Franchi and Mauri were two important Badogliane formations, respectively headed by Edgardo Sogno del Volino and Enrico Martini, aka Mauri. See Giorgio Bacca, Storia dell'Italia Partigiana. 3. Auguste Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, Axel, trans. Marilyn Gaddis Rose. 170. 4. The index card includes our translation from Théophile Gautier, Preface, in Poésies Complètes, Vol. 1, Premières Poésies, 1830-1832, Albertus, 1832, Poésies diverses, 1833-1838, Edition Maurice Dreyfus, 4. Chapter 5. 1. Perg. Ziv. 53, 54. The English translation is from Dante Alighieri, Purgatorio, trans. Jean Hollander and Robert Hollander, with an introduction and notes by Robert Hollander, 531. 2. First published anonymously as Norme per la redazione di un testo radiofonico, then enlarged in Carlo Emilio Gatta, Norme per la redazione di un testo radiofonico. 3. Eco is referring to the Italian idealist philosopher Giovanni Gentile. 4. Despite Eco's compelling argument regarding this topic, his advice in this paragraph does not necessarily reflect current English usage. 5. In our translation in Table 5. 1. We quoted from James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Authoritative Text, Backgrounds and Contexts, Criticism, ed. John Paul Riquelme, Text edition Hans Walter Gabler with Walter Hatch, and from Gabriele D'Annunzio, The Flame, trans. Susan Bassnett, 10. 6. There are various ways to format block quotations on the printed page. They can be set in a smaller font size, or indented, or single-spaced if the rest of the text is double-spaced. When typing your thesis, you should follow the formatting guidelines set by your institution. 7. This is not always the case in current English usage. Different manuals recommend different practices in this situation. 8. The country girl is coming from the fields. Giacomo Leopardi, The Village Saturday, in the Cantai, with a selection of his prose, trans. J. G. Nichols, 106. 9. The cypresses that to Bulgari go tall and straight from San Guido in double lines. Giosu Carducci, The Cypresses of San Guido, in the New Lyrics of Giosu Carducci, trans. William Fletcher Smith, 66. 10. Maud Nugent, Sweet Rosie O'Grady, 1896, in 500 Best Love Song Lyrics, Comp and Edition Roland Herder, 336. 11. Music before all things, uneven rhythm suits it well in air more vague insoluble with nothing there that weighs or clings. Paul Verlaine, Art Poétique, in selected verse, a bilingual edition, trans. And edition Doris Jean Gurevich, 136, 137-12. Ibid. 13. Note that I fabricated this example ad hoc to contain references of different kinds, and I would not swear to its reliability or conceptual clarity. Also note that, for reasons of simplicity, I have limited the bibliography to the essential data, neglecting the requirements of accuracy and completeness listed in Section 3. 2.3. And finally, what we define as a standard bibliography in Table 5.3 can take various forms, depending on the citation style you adopt. 14. The French writer François-Marie Arouet is better known by his pen name Voltaire. Chapter 6. 1. Despite the cleverness of the following system, it is rarely used by contemporary English writers.